Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on attack on Israel, implications and impact. Before we start, let me briefly introduce Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all are aware that on 7th October this year, Palestinian militant groups led by Hamas launched a large-scale invasion and offensive attack against Israel from Gaza Strip. The militants broke through the Gaza-Israel barrier and forced their way through Gaza border crossings, entering nearby Israeli settlement and military installations. It is the first direct conflict within Israel boundaries since the 1948 Arab-Israel War. Hostilities were initiated in the early morning with a rocket barricade against Israel and vehicle transported incursion into Israel territory, with several attacks on surrounding Israeli civilian communities and Israeli military bases. Some observations has referred to these events as the beginning of the third Palestinian Intifada. For the first time since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which took place almost exactly 50 years before the 2023 attack, Israel formally declared war. The total loss of life from Israel has risen to at least 900, and according to the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza, the death toll from Israeli air attack and the territory has also risen to 704. Civilians and dual nations from more than 20 countries were killed or remain missing following violence in Israel. As of now, 20 Nepalese have also lost their lives. It is in this context we are hosting this webinar. To talk on this issue, we have Mr. Chiran Jung Thapa. Mr. Chiran Jung Thapa specializes in national security affairs and counter-terrorism. He holds a master's degree from Columbia University and bachelor's degree from State University of New York, College of Geneseo. He has also completed a leadership in Homeland Security course from Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and a program on terrorism and security studies from Marshall Center in Germany. He has also completed Advanced Security Cooperation course from Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. He has authored multiple security data chapters and remains a global counter-terrorism resource person. Mr. Thapa, welcome to our program. Kindly make your remarks in 20-25 minutes, which will follow by question and answers. This program is streamed live on Facebook and several other platforms. We'd also like to request all our participants to drop their questions on Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. You can also tweet or WhatsApp your question if you want. Mr. Thapa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod, for this introduction and this opportunity. Before I start, I just want to start with a disclaimer. I don't represent any groups or organizations at this point, and whatever I'm going to speak on is based on my own personal knowledge and experience and my own personal views. The second is, before I start, I think I want to remember all those that were killed in this horrific incident in Israel. We have lost 10 of our countrymen and hope we will be able to get their deceased bodies back shortly. So we pray for their families and we pray for all the lives lost in Israel as well as in Palestine. Let me begin by starting off with the history of the conflict a little bit. I'm not going to get into the details of it because I'm sure most of you know it's quite a protracted conflict which has lasted for almost 100 years. If you take the history of it. And so the incident that took place recently is not just a result of what happened on Saturday. So it has a history of close to 100 years. You know, the way it started out in terms of how the Brits basically allocated a particular space which is now Israel, back in 1917, is the genesis of this conflict, and it has lasted for over 100 years. It has taken a lot of lives on both sides. It has displaced millions, and I think we have one of the largest refugee or displacements in human history, which is almost like 6 million people have been displaced from their homes and are still living in very horrid conditions across the Middle East and elsewhere. This is the very protracted, very complex conflict, and the incident that took place on Saturday is just an ongoing part of that conflict. This incident is just one part of the conflict. So what happened on Saturday? Why was it so significant? I think that's the question that everybody's asking at this point. Why was it so significant? It was significant because the scale of the attack, the destruction and devastation that it has caused in Israel is something that has basically grabbed the global attention at this point. How was Hamas, a militant group, able to sort of surmount all the barricades, all the high-tech fences, high technology that Israel had put up as its defense system, and still able to inflict such a huge loss onto Israel? I think that is sort of the question that's been boggling minds all across the globe at this point. So what happened on Saturday, which, as Dr. Pramod pointed out, it was almost 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. It was a day when Israelis were relaxing. It was a holiday weekend. From 6 o'clock some even say at least 5:30 in the morning, there were multiple attacks from air, land, and sea onto Israel. So this is the first time a militant group has managed to mount such a massive attack onto Israel. Previously, there were attacks only from land. As you know, Gaza has been, blockaded by Israel for a number of years now. Gaza has one side sea, the other side is linked to Egypt, the other side is borders Israel. So from all the border crossings, so it was not just from one. They attacked from multiple locations into Israel. So it's being called a bulldozer, a bike, and a hand glider attack, which means they came and tore down the fences on the land. They entered through motorbikes and then got onto convoys and started attacking civilians in Israeli territory. They also landed using paragliders onto Israel. But before that, they rained about 5,000 homemade rockets, which basically inundated the defense capability of. It's called the Iron Dome, which was basically inundated, and it's not basically built to withstand that level of attack. So it is said that about 5,000 homemade rockets actually were hurled into the Israeli airspace within 20 minutes. Then, of course, there was incursion from the sea as well. So if you look at the Hamas strategy, the attack strategy, it's been very precisely or meticulously planned. It was to basically inundate the Israeli defense system. So yeah, we saw massive loss of lives. One particular incident where there were party goers at a concert, almost 260 people died in that one particular incident, and the Israelis are already calling it one of the worst since the Holocaust. So when you um, um, heard what the Israeli prime minister said and what the Israeli president said, they basically labeled this the biggest attack on Israel after the Holocaust, because the number of lives lost during one incident has been the largest in Israel's recent history. What else? So everybody is calling it the failure of the intelligence agencies. I think that's the narrative that's been coming out, and people are discussing this. How could the Israeli intelligence services that are known to be the best in the world not manage to sniff this level of activity, this level of planning, the level of communication that must have gone on to plan for such an attack? So it's being called the failure of the intelligence communities. But I want to take the audience back and a little bit back. I think it's not just a failure to detect this incident or the planning of this incident, but I think it's also a bit of a failure to of the intelligence agency to see how many weapon or rockets that were being amassed even before this, because to make that amount of rockets, you required a lot of rocket fuel. You need a lot of substances to basically concoct that particular missile. So I would take one step back just to be able to basically sniff out that level of planning and preparation. I think was also a failure. Then the failure was, of course, to detect and deter the attack. One, there was also failure in terms of when the attack happened to defend and protect its civilians immediately, because the incursion was by land, by sea, by air, and it seemed like there was quite a bit of disarray on the first few hours. And then, of course, the talk of the response. When the attack happened, what was the Israeli response? Because the militants had control over the Israeli territory for a number of hours, and we still don't know whether there are still more within the Israeli territory, although Israel has claimed that they have conducted the sweep operations, and most of the those involved in the attack have been neutralized or they've gone back. Now, the second part of it, the difficulty is these guys have taken around 100 hostages. This is the first time in recent time when Israel has lost or has there's been this number of hostages in Israeli history. The last one I can remember was back about 50 years ago, when the Entebbe, when the Air France was hijacked, and there were about 40 or 50, or I think about 90 Israeli citizens that were in that aircraft and taken to Uganda at the Entebbe airport. And that was one of the most magnificent Israeli operations ever conducted in terms of rescue. So I think that was the last time when such a large number of Israeli nationals were abducted. One other thing I want to talk about the Hamas attack was the way you sort of look at this strategy. It was basically they had this whole strategy of inundating the air. They were incursion by the land, and there was infiltration by the sea. And it happened like simultaneously, and it was like a blitzkrieg where it happened so quickly, so fast, that the response time and the ability to respond, it basically allowed very little time for the Israeli side to respond. One of the things that this particular incident has done is basically Israel, known for its precision and perfection in the military realm because of all the hostilities that surrounds Israel, has always been, very articulate, very meticulous in everything, and they've managed to erect a very robust, defense system and a deterrence against all its enemies that surround it. This particular incident has basically shattered that particular aura that Israel had managed to erect over the years, at least temporarily, because I think Hamas has managed to steal that show by mounting this level of incursion and inflicting that level of damage on. It is probably the first time one nuclear power has been, breached in this manner also. So all in all, this is a very unprecedented attack on Israel, both in terms of audacity, the level of casualty, and the level of impact. But also, I think the response will, from the Israeli side, would also be equally severe in scope and severity, I think. Moving forward, there's quite a bit of symbolism on this attack because it happened 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. So there's symbolism in that. The timing, whenever we look at an incident from a counter-terrorism perspective, there are 4 T's that we look at. One is timing, the other one is target, the third one is the tactics used and the technology that was used. I've spoken already about the timing of the attack. It was early in the morning. I've spoken about a little bit about the targets. Who were the targets? I mean, it was pretty much Israel was the target, but who within Israel? It was indiscriminate because it was not just Israelis that were killed during this incident. Nepal lost 10, and there are multiple nations that have lost, their nationals in this attack. So, multiple nations are affected by this. Tactics, as you saw, Israel as one of the most sophisticated countries in the world in terms of technology and in terms of defense technology in particular. They had the Iron Dome, which was created to basically thwart any such missile attacks, but they were not sort of built to withstand thousands raining onto their territory. So they managed to, employ those very crafty tactics to overwhelm their air defenses. They also managed to use the bulldozers and to basically ram through the walls and the fences that Israel had built around Gaza. Very innovative tactics of using hand gliders, paragliders. Almost inconceivable at this point. They managed to sort of use that technology. It's when I look at this incident, it's basically low tech versus high tech, and in terms of high investment versus low investment. So you can see how low investment and low tech has managed to somehow overwhelm like the high tech power like Israel. So it was not just in the 3 realms that this incursion took place. Incursions also took place on the psychological realm because during this incident, there was a lot of live streaming about the killings, about capturings. So it has inflicted a very huge moral blow as well, using the cyberspace to basically propagate the propaganda and use this information to spread it all across the world. What else? Now, what's the threat of an incident like this? If you look at what happened, and if you try to foresee what could happen as a result of this, there are multiple things that could happen. We could have a full-fledged war between Israel and Hamas, which has already begun. The Israeli forces have already started pounding Gaza with artillery and air power. Possibly a ground incursion could ensue out in a few days. There could be a 2 or a 3 front war because there is a bigger enemy that resides on the northern borders of Israel. Hezbollah is still there. There are the Syrians. There could be a multiple front war between Israel and its enemies. It could even, stoke a regional war depending on who gets involved and how. We could also see that the Americans have dispatched one of their aircraft carriers close to Israel in support of Israel. That, of course, is going to have an impact as well. We could see this could be a time where the American attention is drawn towards Israel and the Middle East. That's when possibly things could go different on the Ukrainian front as well. The Americans in the West have been supporting Ukraine against their war against Russia, so it could have a different impact on that particular front. There's mounting tensions in the China Strait between the Chinese and between China and Taiwan. So there are multiple, threats that could ensue as a result of what just happened. Implications depends on who you are looking at. The immediate implications are for the Israelis and the Palestinians. Of course, it's for the Israeli government. And the Israeli security services and the intelligence services. What just happened in Israel will probably warrant a huge rethink in their strategy and their approach towards defense and deterrence, because what just happened basically undermined all they had erected in all these years. So it probably will warrant a massive rethink. There will probably be investigations and reviews into how such an incident was allowed and how this happened. Second, on the Palestinian side and also on the Israeli side, because of this conflict, there will, of course, be massive suffering on both sides. Israel has already laid a siege onto Gaza, which means they've cut off water supplies, electricity, food, anything going into Gaza for now. So there will be massive suffering in Gaza and will probably cause a huge humanitarian crisis out there. Similarly, there could be multiple attacks on Israel within Israeli territory, but also the threat of attacks on Israeli civilians or Israeli interests across the globe. We cannot deny that as well. There's also going to be there are implications for the U.S. government as well, because now the U.S. government has been drawn into it. The U.S. government has been is the largest supporter of Israel. Probably Israel is the largest recipient of military aid from the United States. So this incident is definitely going to change that dynamic as well. The focus that was there in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict will probably be shifted towards the Middle East. I don't know how that will have an impact on the Russian and Ukrainian conflict, but will definitely have an impact out there. Similarly with the China-Taiwan conflict. One of the things that worries me most is an attack like this will serve as fuel and fodder to the extremist groups all across the globe, because after COVID, I think we witnessed lesser attacks from terrorist groups and extremist groups, at least compared to before. So this will probably serve to inspire a lot of groups, irrespective of who they're fighting against and who their target is. So that's the thing, that's the threat, that's the global threat coming out of this conflict, particularly in our region as well, in Pakistan, in India, in Myanmar, and all the way down to the Southeast Asia as well, in Philippines. I mean, I'm sure you heard about the Marawi incident in the past, in Indonesia, in the Sahel in Africa, for example. There could be, it would probably serve to inspire the extremist groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, that have laid dormant for quite some time. this could probably also have an impact on the African subcontinent, because as we've seen a lot of military coups in Africa, Niger, Mali, and others, because of the lack of attention and focus on that particular region, because the global powers would probably be more focused on the Middle East. Why has this particular incident taken place right now and not before? I mean, multiple ways of looking at it. There's a geopolitical narrative that has been built up, which is basically dominating the narrative at this point, where people think that this was perpetrated or basically prodded by Iran, which supports Hamas, to ensure that the Saudis and the Israelis don't shake hands and become a formidable force in the Middle East, because that's completely going to change the dynamic in the Middle East. Iran and Saudis have a long, bitter history. So the Iranians don't want the Israelis to come together with Israel. Like, that's been the dominant political narrative. So for now, temporarily, I think that prospect of the Saudis and the Israelis coming together in a rapprochement is probably less at this point, but you never know what's going to happen next. What else? From the Nepali perspective, as you all know, that we've lost 10 of our nationals. I think several others have been injured, and I think some of them are missing. But then we have thousands of people that actually live and work in Israel at this point. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think somewhere between like 15 to 20,000 reside in Israel at this point. So the threat upon them is, of course, very real. Like, whatever happens in Israel is going to have an impact on Nepali nationals. So that automatically warrants a huge, thought from the Nepali government and Nepal in terms of ensuring their safety and security, whether we're going to evacuate them, whether we're going to tell them to, stay put in bunkers. It's the government has to really think about it. There was talk about how we're going to retrieve the bodies of the deceased. I think the government was planning to send an aircraft. One of the things that, a lesson that we can draw from this is, incidents like this are bound to happen in the future as well, anywhere in the world, because the Nepali diaspora across the globe has increased quite a bit. We have a lot of people in the Middle East, in Qatar, in Saudi, in the UAE, places like Jordan, similarly in Malaysia. So any incident of this nature, if there is an exodus of, or will warrant an exodus of our nationals, it will be very difficult for the government to repatriate or to evacuate. So we need to start planning in terms of, if there's an incident that takes place, how we do it, because the responsibility we have towards our citizens is, of course, real. So the government really needs to start planning. I mean, at one point, I had basically advised the government and the military to sort of have that, airlift capability, especially in terms of the military in particular needs to procure that airlift capability, given that the need is there. Even if, we're not evacuating people, if we have large military aircrafts, we can always use them for multiple purposes. So I think the Army also needs to give thought in terms of the airlift capability for the future. Dr. Pramod, have I gone beyond my time, or do I still have more time?
If you want, you can take 2-3 minutes. You have taken around 25 minutes. So you're
okay. I think I'll end here, and I would rather take questions because
sure.
that would be more interesting.
Okay, Thank you, Mr. Thapa, for a very comprehensive presentation. You touched on different aspects of the conflict, including the historical aspect of it. We have also received lots of questions. Without taking any time, let me open the floor for question and answer round. Let me start with some of the questions that we have got on Facebook Live. There might be some repetitions because we have received questions at different point of time. So one is that which you have mentioned during your presentation that and there's lots of question on that about the failure of intelligence. You have already touched on this during your presentation, but let me still share it in case you want to add more to it. How could Hamas cross all the high-tech barricades in Israel, which has huge reputation for its intelligence as well as defense technology? That is one. Second is that what do you think about the failure of Mossad to predict this attack? A similar question, series of questions on that, maybe 7 or 8. Second question is how it is going to impact the geopolitics when we have Russia-Ukraine war, China and US are at loggerhead. How is it going to impact the global politics at the moment? Let me start with these two questions and I'll try to get back to you.
Thanks, Dr. Pramod, and thank you to the participants on the question on the intelligence failure. I think the biggest discourse in this incident is exactly that. How could the intelligence services fail? As most of you know, Israel is known to have perhaps the best intelligence service in the world. Because when you look at intelligence services, it's it's multifold. It's not just about gathering information, but acting on information as well, right? So Israel has several intelligence services. I mean, they have their military intelligence called Amman. They have Mossad, which people know about because of the operations it conducts. They have Shin Bet, which is their internal intelligence agencies. They have something called the Unit 8200, which is the signal intelligence. They even have a unit which basically specializes on developing new technology for intelligence services. So the intelligence architecture of Israel is not just massive. It's in terms of scope, but in terms of capability as well, right? So how could militant group basically evade that level of sophisticated architecture that the Israelis have built up? Is the question that will probably boggle the minds for a long period of time. But from what I've learned in the last couple of days, you are able to sniff information if you share it, like whether it's signal intelligence, if you call on the phone, right? They're able to intercept it. It seems like there were no calls made whatsoever. So it was all one-to-one person in the rooms. Only a few people knew about it. They kept it very hush-hush, number one. So the signal intelligence could not pick up any communication because there were no signal communications that happened that described or talked or even indicated or implied any level of planning on that, number one. Number two, then there's the human intelligence part. Like Israelis have a number of agents, embedded within Gaza and all of that. But it seems like even they were not able to sort of intercept or infiltrate the Hamas ranks and get us idea about what was happening. The other thing about Gaza is one of the things that's being discussed, at least within the security community, is the number of tunnels. The Israelis call it the terror tunnels. So the tunnels that the Hamas has been able to build, some of them even like 20 stories deep. So people are speculating that a lot of the plannings actually took place within these tunnels, these terror tunnels, whereby, nothing on the surface could basically, capture the level of communication or the level of planning. So the Israeli intelligence failure was basically a result of a very sophisticated level of planning, both in terms of the planning of the attack, the execution of the attack, right? It's not just the failure of the intelligence, but it was also failure of the defense forces to be able to deter because that level of incursion is just inconceivable, or when you start breaking down the barriers in like hundreds, and there's no defense against that. And even in the air, like when you have hundreds of paragliders coming in, or when you have thousands of missiles raining in, like Israel was not able to sort of surmount that immediately. So I hope I've answered that question. Is there anything more specific on that?
Let me come. We'll get similar questions. We'll get back to. Let me add a few more questions. Like you talked about the significance. So, what is the significance of this attack on Israel? And do you see the possibility of full-fledged war, or do you also see other power getting into this conflict? Means, do you see any escalation? That is one. Second is, how is this war going to affect the recently agreed India Middle East Europe corridor, IMEC? That is second. And third, like, do you think this attack can change the paradigm of war? I think we tend to focus on the technology of weapons, such as the accuracy of the missile. However, this attack provided that the side with low technology can still damage the opponent by causing on the quantity of weapons. So will this attack change the paradigm of war strategies and weapon industries?
Yeah. Can I start with the last question? Because I find that question quite interesting, and I actually believe that I think this is a watershed moment in the history of warfare, right? When you have a very advanced society with advanced technology, and a more primitive adversary is able to sort of penetrate through that technological barrier that a more advanced society has erected. So definitely will change the paradigm in terms of defense. Now, let me try to use an example and try to explain the economic cost. Like, war always has an economic cost, right? It's going to inflict a huge economic cost on Israel. How? For example, the missiles that were launched by Hamas against Israel, almost like 5,000, they apparently cost no more than $100 to build, right? Now, the missiles that will be sent through the Iron Dome battery to intercept these missiles will cost about 50,000. So you can see the disparity in terms of the investments that have to be made, right? So you have a very low tech against high tech, and low investment against high investment. So now I think the defense planners will now need to rethink how they can basically minimize their cost and make their defenses more effective against that, right? I believe that Israel now is already experimenting something called an iron beam technology, which costs far less. I think it costs about $3 to intercept a missile. So, I think the paradigm of warfare and the technology along with it will change, because now the onus is on the defense planners and the technology builders. By the way, Israel has one of the largest technology firms in the world per capita. I think there are more technology firms in Israel than anywhere else in the world. So now they'll have to really start thinking about cheaper and more effective defense technologies to basically taking lessons from what just happened, right? So yeah, I think the paradigm of warfare will also change. The second is, I think, when people are motivated and when people have a cause, that's a huge attribute in war, like war, whether it's more advanced and even when you're outnumbered, the motivation of an enemy, an attribute within war, is a very critical factor, right? So this will also be studied in terms of warfare. Now, planning, right? Although it seems like a militant group, but the level of attrition and the level of planning seems like a full-fledged military had planned this, air assaults, land incursions, sea incursions, right? Fighting on the cyber domain. So it's an integrated sort of warfare that the militant group has been able to mount against its adversaries. So this will also be studied. not just by countries, but also by militant groups across the world, because now this is basically set a benchmark for a lot of these extremist groups. They will take lessons from how they did it and will probably try to replicate it and learn from it as well. So that's one threat that we'll have to sort of think about. The second, about the escalation part, there's always the possibility of escalation, because depending on the incident, what happens, who gets involved, and how it basically evolves, there's always a possibility. It really depends on how Israel basically responds to Hamas and to some of its neighbors. For example, how is Israel's response going to be towards particular countries? Iran, right? Iran is known to have supported Hamas. So how will Israel respond to Iran? Previously, the Israelis basically used the Stuxnet virus to basically slow down their nuclear centrifuges and basically slow down their development of nuclear weapons, right? We know about that. Israel has taken very audacious, operations, including, bombing the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq, and done some really audacious, operations to neutralize any threats that they see would harm Israel. So how is Israel going to, react towards Iran? Second, how is Israel going to react to Qatar? Qatar is where the Hamas leadership are residing at the moment, and I think there are a lot of Hamas leaders are also in Turkey. So these are countries that play host to Hamas leaders, right? So depending on what the Israeli response is towards the Hamas leaders and the countries that are basically hosting the Hamas leaders, will also have an impact on, will probably determine the level of escalation. Now, Iran, in terms of the geopolitical, configuration and alliances, Iran is becoming a member of SCO, right? And probably scheduled to join the BRICS, group as well. The Saudis are going to join the BRICS. So there's this very complicated web of alliances being built, across. Whereas Turkey, is a NATO member, but still playing host to Hamas. So it's not as easy. There are these really complex webs that are intersecting, and it really depends on how these webs sort of interact and what are some of the manifestations of that. So that will probably determine how the thing will escalate. The third question about India, Middle East corridor, Europe corridor, it's too early to tell how that will evolve, because there are too many unknown variables at this point in terms of how this conflict is going to shape, whether it's going to result in a full-blown war, whether it's going to in a regional conflict, or is it going to be subdued very quickly. So it's too early to tell, but for the short term, I think it will definitely be impacted, because the focus will be on trying to douse the flames within the Middle East, because it's going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact on multiple fronts. For example, there's always an economic cost that not just the region, but the world is going to incur. There are already flights that are being canceled. There are flights that are being sort of will probably avoid that particular geographical area, will add costs. The price of oil has already gone up, which will of course have impact on the inflation. For Israel in particular, Israel is selling almost like $30 billion of its foreign exchange to stabilize the shekel, which is their currency. The currency has already lost, I think, almost 7 to 10% of the value in the last 3 days, right? So it's already had an impact. The stock markets are taking a hit. So it has, major impacts, not just on Israel or the region, but also in the globe. So that will also determine, I think, in terms of how that particular, the escalation or the India-Middle East corridor is going to shape up.
Thank you. Let me take another three questions.
Sure.
There are lots of questions on Russia-Ukraine war implications. So how would the conflict between Israel and Palestine and rising tension in the Middle East affect the Russia-Ukraine war? That is one question. Second is, are Israel's recent peace agreement with several Arab countries a step in the right direction? And what will be the implication on that? Uh, at the same time, how is it going to, how is this attack going to impact the US foreign policy? And we also know that the US is having presidential election next year in 2024. So will this attack impact their elections as well? Let me take one more question, and how does this attack impact Nepal? What will be the impact on Nepal, the impact of this war on our country? How should Nepal react to it? As you know that Nepal and Israel enjoy excellent relations, but at the same time, we also have economic dependency on Middle East, where a huge number of Nepalese migrant workers are working on that. So how should Nepal react on these issues at the moment?
Yeah. So I have four questions. Let me begin from the Russia-Ukraine war, right? How is this particular conflict going to have an impact on Russia-Ukraine war? So the first thing is in terms of focus, right? The focus is going to be shifted to the Middle East immediately. Has already shifted, right? So the US has already dispatched its aircraft carrier, which means it has demonstrated that level of commitment. And probably a significant amount of funds will be rechanneled towards Israel, because Israel will probably basically solicit, military aid and assistance, because the Iron Dome to be replaced by a better, defense system will require investment. So the investment that was going from the West and the US towards the Ukraine conflict will probably be diverted. So that is automatically going to have an impact on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So what kind of impact? I'm sure the level of lack of investment or the lowering of investment will definitely be seen in the battlefield in terms of how the Ukrainians can, stand up against the Russians in terms of armaments, in terms of artillery, in terms of drones and everything. So that there's definitely going to be an impact. The other impact is geopolitical. For example, that the leader of the Arab League has flown to Russia right after this incident. So there are conversations that are taking place between the Arab League and the Russians. We don't know what's happening in terms of what sort of conversations are taking place, but the fact that the Arab League decided to send the leader of the Arab League into Russia, Moscow, right after this incident is quite telling, right? They didn't go to the US or they didn't go to anywhere in the West, but went to Moscow immediately. It didn't go to Beijing. So that is quite telling in terms of how this is shaping up. The second was, I believe, the peace accords that Israel is having with neighboring countries. How is that going to impact? I think, of course, that is creating a more stable environment for Israel in the long run, because Israel had a very hostile neighborhood that it had to basically guard itself against, beginning back in the 1947 when Egypt, Jordan, Syria, like almost everybody was against, the whole entire Arab nations were against Israel. So they've slowly sort of started that rapprochement. Now there are few countries left where Israel still has to have diplomatic relations, and they're trying to stabilize the relationship. Of course, Saudis being one of the major powers in the Middle East, they've been trying that for the last number of years, and they were very close to it as well until this happened. And of course, then there's Iran and other countries like Turkey. And so, but the process by where Israel is making efforts to stabilize relations with these major countries is definitely a strategic victory for Israel, because it's trying to ensure the level of security that it desires for its people, right, in the neighborhood. So it's definitely a positive way forward. US foreign policy, is it going to have an impact? one of the first things after the incident is, of course, the implications on the U.S. foreign policy is going to be massive because, as you said, there are elections coming up next year. Israel has the most powerful lobby in Washington. Everybody knows that. The support for Israel has always been there since it was founded. The Republicans are already basically accusing Biden of not doing enough to support the Israelis and not. Can I take one more point on the on the American side? The failure of the Israeli intelligence community is also being imputed as the failure of the American intelligence architecture as well, because the American intelligence architecture is also very vast, very robust. There's a lot of information sharing between Israel and America, but it's almost an intelligence failure of all the countries, allies of Israel, because they too were not able to detect this level of activity prior to this, right? So even the American intelligence architecture was not able to sort of provide any sort of indication or warning that this was coming. So this will, of course, have an impact on the U.S. foreign policy and on the elections, because it will be a major issue in the upcoming election as to who will be better in the Oval Office to defend and support Israel. Will be a very major issue in the debates. Now, your question about how Nepal has been impacted and how Nepal should react to it. This is not the first time that Nepal has been impacted by an act of terror like this. This has happened in the past in Iraq. Our people were killed back then, and in 2016 again in Afghanistan, I think 10 people were killed, and this is the third major loss for Nepal. And what we need to foresee in the future is Nepalese are spread across the world in multiple landscapes and are prone to all these violent activities or incidents that may take place. So this won't be the last time when Nepal is going to be impacted by an incident of this nature. So we will have to first sort of prepare our system to sort of deal with these incidents that may happen in the future. So that should go into planning, and that's the foresight planning. How should Nepal react to it? I mean, we should plan for it, first of all, right? We should anticipate these incidents to take place. We should anticipate these events to take place in the Middle East and how it's going to have an impact on us, how it's going to have an impact on our labor market. As you pointed out, there are hundreds of thousands of Nepalese working in the Middle East, and any level of conflict or conflagration in that region will have a direct bearing on us. How are we going to, how will we evacuate if we have to evacuate, right? So there has to be planning. And how do we sort of optimize our relationship with the Middle Eastern countries as well as Israel? Nepal was one of the first countries to recognize Israel back in 1960, and they used to actually say, the first Israeli embassy east of Jerusalem was in Kathmandu, right? And not only that, Nepal has always been a top destination for Israeli tourists. Prior to joining their mandatory military service or after their courses, Israelis have always selected Nepal as one of their preferred destinations. So we also have to worry about, the security of Israelis coming and visiting, and as well as the Israeli interest and infrastructure within the country. Nepal in particular, I believe, has been voting against Israel at the UN and at these multilateral forums. I don't know what is the sort of rationale that basically compels or drives Nepal to vote against Israel. That is also, we have to review that, whether they're trying to play a balancing act to ensure that we don't antagonize or aggravate the Middle Eastern power players like Qatar and UAE and other Saudis. So we really have to rethink, but also also we need to call a spade, right? When there are such acts of violence, we ourselves have endured, violence in the past. So we are, victims of violence in the past as well. So we should really think about how we're going to balance these relationships and our values and our principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter and the principles of Panchashila. How are we going to sort of cumulatively take these principles and our values and sort of react and engage with our foreign partners like Israel or the Middle Eastern powers?
We are running out of time. We hardly have 6 minutes, but we have huge around, like, I think we still have 30 questions. So I don't think we are going to manage time for that. But what I'll do is, like, let me give you an idea of what kind of questions we have, and then you can wrap up in 5 minutes. Like you rightly pointed out, that the failure of Israeli intelligence is also the failure of US intelligence, and that is the similar questions we are getting from different people on Facebook. Second, from your perspective, are there prospects for long-term peace and reconciliation between Israel and Palestine? And if there are any negotiations underway, can they be considered applicable and sustainable solution? That is one. And there are lots of questions on the implication it could have on the region and beyond, how it can impact on Nepal, which you have answered. There are also, like, the threats that may eliminate from this attack, and what do you think that will what do you think that Israel is to do to get the hostages back, and the future of military strategy it will undertake to defend and determine threats? There's a similar question within the line. So if you want to maybe wrap up in 2-3 minutes, taking one or two of these questions.
Yeah, I think I did not speak about the hostages because that's a very important factor in this particular incident. There are about 100. Apparently, reportedly there are about 100 that have been taken into Gaza, right? So this is the first time Israel is having to confront this crisis at this point to be able to rescue this many hostages. There are, women, children, elderly, as well as senior military officials that have been abducted, several foreign nationals as well. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. So let me sort of sequentially try to describe how this process could work. Number one, Israel has to very definitively and quickly ascertain the number of hostages that were taken, in terms of the numbers, the location, the nationalities. At this point, there's still a fog of war, so it's difficult to ascertain those numbers. Second, I think Israel has to really get up and get that tactical intelligence underway to determine where they are, who's guarding them, and where they're being placed, right? My guess is, they'll either take them through their underground tunnel networks to a place where they can't be detected, or they will put them in targets where they think the Israelis might actually attack in terms of mount an air assault or a missile, launch a missile. So they will use them as human shields. So that's my thought. What are the options Israel has at this point in terms of with the hostages? Well, either they'll have to negotiate, right? They'll have to negotiate a release. Is that a prospect at this point? I think it's less likely that they will negotiate it at this point, but you never know. I mean, depends on who has been taken and what the policy warrants and what the people basically demand at that point. Second, Israel is known to mount one of the most daring and meticulous rescue operations in the world. They're known for that. Are they going to do it? Less likely, because they don't know where they're placed and how many, because it's not just one or two, it's like multiple, right? Third way of retrieving the hostages will probably be for Israel to inflict a very intolerable amount of cost, whether it's economic or pain, onto Hamas, so that they are compelled to give up the hostages, where they cannot tolerate the level of attrition that Israel is going to mount. Is that likely at this point? Less likely, because that could also, risk the hostages at this point. But one thing that we can draw from the pronouncements made by the Israeli Prime Minister and the IDF spokesperson is, they've said something like, we'll make them pay for it like never before, and we'll leave no stone unturned to get the hostages back. I just want to give you a metric and the audience a metric in terms of what has happened in the past. The Israelis accord a huge amount of value in every single life, every single hostage is taken. Back in 2012, I think there was a exchange. There was one soldier that was taken away, and they released 1,000 hostages. So there's always this metric used within the security community. One person for Israel is about 30 people in the United States. They're making these comparisons during these discussions. So 1,000 dead for Israelis, meaning like, almost like 30 to 40,000 dead in Israeli terms, right? 100 hostages, meaning that's almost like 3,000 hostages for them. So it's the scale is quite massive in terms of what Israel has to do. What was the other one? Sorry. Long-term peace. Yeah. The prospect for long-term peace, I think we cannot deny that the prospects are always there. If we look at human history, like, there have been wars that have lasted for hundreds of years and that have come to an end. So we cannot, fully ascertain when this is going to end. But we can hope that the prospect for a peaceful settlement is always there, because sometimes such violent incidents may sort of open like space for a negotiated settlement and open a pathway towards peace. So we cannot deny that, and hope we should hope that there will be prospect towards peace. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Thapa, for the wonderful talk. We still have lots of questions, but we need to end it here. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you again at NICE in future. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for listening attentively and patiently. Thank you.